So one question I often get asked is why do we subtract imports? Why not just ignore them entirely, right? Adding exports makes sense, right? Exports are things that we produce, here and send over there. And so because they're produced here, we want to count them toward our gross domestic product. But why do we subtract things that were made somewhere else and purchased here? Why don't we just ignore them? And the answer is that we do and we don't. And this is, I don't want to sound pithy, but this is going to be an all too familiar statement that we're going to be making throughout this course. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's figure out why we do this. Let's first note that C, I, and G count all forms of consumption, investment, and government spending that are done by people within the US border. So in other words, anytime you purchase something that counts as consumption, regardless of where it comes from, it counts towards C. So really, we could replace this consumption variable with consumption on domestic goods plus consumption of foreign goods. And we could do the same for investment goods. We could call them domestic and foreign goods. And we could do the same for government purchases, having domestic and a foreign component. Okay, where the subscripts, the D denotes domestic and the F denotes foreign. So what we'd really want, so what GDP ought to be, is the stuff that we buy on domestic goods or spend on domestic consumption, plus our spending on domestic investment purchases, plus our domestic government purchases, plus exports, right? That would be all the things that we produced within an economy or within the United States, in our case, within 1 year. So this is kind of like the goal, okay? But what we have is Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. So the question is, how do we get from here to here, okay? Are those two things equal? And I'm going to show you that they actually are. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of these and I'm going to substitute them in here. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do that. So Y is equal to CD plus CF plus ID plus IF plus GD plus GF plus exports minus imports. Okay. And let's just separate the domestic and the foreign variables. Just rearrange these additions, these sums. So Y is equal to CD plus ID plus GD plus CF plus IF plus GF plus exports minus imports. Okay, so that looks hairy, but check this out. If we think about this, CF plus IF plus GF, well, that's all the spending that we do as a country on foreign goods, right? Everything we purchase as a foreign good is either going to count as toward our consumption, toward our investment, or toward our government purchases. There are no other categories that this could fall into. So really, this right here should be exactly equal to the amount that we spend on imports, right? And so if this is equal, then we can do some more substitution, right? So we can say, okay, Y is equal to CD plus ID plus GD plus imports plus exports minus imports. And now you're probably noticing that this cancels out, and we're left with that equation before that makes sense, right? And so really, this whole subtracting imports, this whole net exports is equal to exports minus imports, that is an accounting identity. Not an economic identity. right? We do it because we need to balance the equation. We need to have this pop out. And because we don't know, who is spending what on what, but we do know flows of goods and services into the country, it's easier for us to just calculate this, right? Because we know this number, but we might not know what CF is equal to, for example. We might not know what IF is equal to, or what GF is equal to, but we know what imports are equal to. And so even though this equation here is much more accurate, this equation here is much easier to work with.